After the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers descended on the field carrying pliers, and they weren't searching for gold or weapons. They were wrenching teeth from the mouths of dead soldiers, and sometimes from the mouths of soldiers who were still dying. Those teeth, yanked from the jaws of young men killed by cannonball and saber, sold as premium dentures across Europe under the brand name Waterloo teeth. Buyers considered them desirable because the men they came from had been healthy and young, which made them a step up from the usual source of denture material. Teeth pried from disease-riddled corpses dug out of ordinary cemeteries. What that means is that if you wore false teeth in 1820s London, well, there was a real chance you were chewing your dinner with the front teeth of a 22-year-old French infantryman who had died face down in Belgian mud. That is the kind of story Waterloo produces, because on June 18th, 1815, more than 50,000 men became casualties in 9 hours of fighting on a rain-soaked plateau barely 3 miles wide. No other day in the Napoleonic Wars killed and maimed more people. And if you had been one of Napoleon's soldiers that morning, a common infantryman in the Armée du Nord, you would have faced roughly a 1 in 3 chance of being killed, wounded, or captured before sunset. What follows is the story of what that day actually felt like, and we're going to walk through it together, hour by hour, to answer one question: whether you could have survived it. We start with how you got here. And 8 weeks ago, there was no army. Napoleon escaped from the island of Elba on February the 26th, 1815. Sailing with roughly 1,000 men on a single brig, landed in southern France, marched north, and somewhere near Grenoble, the regiment sent to arrest him. Switched sides after he walked up to them alone and reportedly shouted, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." Nobody did. Marshal Ney, who had promised the king he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, joined him with 6,000 troops 10 days later. And by March 20th, Napoleon entered Paris without firing a shot. What happened next was an administrative miracle. He rebuilt the French army from 46,000 men to nearly 200,000 in about 2 months, though that was still no match for the 750,000 Allied troops mobilizing across Europe. His strategy was classic Napoleon: strike fast into Belgium and destroy Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and Blücher's Prussians before they could link up. And he crossed the Belgian frontier on June the 15th with surprise on his side. Wellington, attending the Duchess of Richmond's ball in Brussels that night, reportedly exclaimed, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God." 2 days before Waterloo, on June 16th, Napoleon fought 2 battles simultaneously. He crushed Blücher at Ligny with roughly 16,000 battle casualties plus 8,000 Prussian deserters, while Ney battled Wellington to a draw at Quatre Bras. And that's when the first catastrophic blunder happened. d'Erlon's entire corps of roughly 20,000 men spent the day marching between both battles without fighting at either, trapped between conflicting orders. And 20,000 men walked all day and accomplished nothing. Wellington pulled back to a pre-selected position on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean on June 17th, and then the thunderstorm hit, and both armies collapsed into the mud. The army, you're now standing in fields about 72,000 men at Waterloo. Your uniform, charitably, is falling apart. Inspection reports from the previous year showed that half of all uniform items needed repair or replacement, and historians describe your marching column as dilapidated. You're wearing a worn forage cap, a civilian overcoat with tarnished epaulets, and loose trousers of coarse fabric sewn in workshops over the past 10 weeks. You look less like a soldier of the Grande Armée and more like a man who lost a bet at a costume party. But you are a veteran, and most of the men around you have seen combat before. You know how to use the weapon on your shoulder, and that is what matters now. That weapon is the Charleville musket, model 1777, a smooth-bore, muzzle-loading flintlock weighing about 10 pounds that fires a .69 caliber lead ball and is accurate to, and this is generous, about 75 yards against an individual target. In actual battlefield conditions, roughly 5 to 7% of musket shots connected with anything at all. One military expert declared in 1814 that no man was ever killed at 200 yards by a common musket by the person who aimed at him. You are carrying what amounts to a statistical suggestion rather than a precise instrument of death. Firing it requires tearing open a paper cartridge with your teeth, which stains them black with gunpowder residue, as pouring powder into the pan and barrel, ramming a lead ball down the muzzle, and pulling the trigger. A trained soldier can manage 2 to 3 rounds per minute. After prolonged firing, the barrel grows so hot that veterans resorted to urinating into their muskets to cool them down, which tells you everything you need to know about the daily realities of Napoleonic warfare. Beyond the musket, you carry a triangular socket bayonet with about 15 inches of blade that locks onto the muzzle via a zigzag slot and extends your weapon to roughly 75 inches total. There's also a short, curved sword called a sabre briquet, which cavalrymen mocked by calling it the firelighter, along with a leather cartridge box containing 35 rounds in a drilled wooden block, plus extras in your knapsack for a total of about 50 to 60. All of it together, musket, ammunition, knapsack, blanket, greatcoat, canteen, haversack, and rations, adds up to roughly 55 to 60 pounds you are hauling through ankle-deep mud across a Belgian field. Your official daily rations should include 24 ounces of bread, 8 ounces of meat, dried beans or rice, and about a litre of wine or a smaller ration of brandy. But that's the theory. On the night before Waterloo, only the Imperial Guard has its own wagon train, and everyone else depends on foraging from the Belgian countryside, which has not been generous. Napoleon is sitting in Le Caillou farmhouse eating white bread, Chambertin wine, and beef. You have almost nothing. One of the most consequential battles in European history, and you'll fight it on an empty stomach. Now about that mud. But on the night of June 17th, a thunderstorm struck the battlefield so violent that veterans called it one of the worst they had ever experienced. One soldier wrote that the rain fell so hard the oldest soldiers there had never seen the like, and you bivouacked in the open with no shelter while your fires drowned in the downpour. Many soldiers slept standing up, leaning on their muskets, or lay among flattened rye crops in mud that swallowed them to the ankles. Artillery wheels sank to their axles, and horses could barely gallop. And here is the detail that changes everything about the battle. Cannonballs that would normally ricochet along hard ground and tear through multiple ranks of men sank harmlessly into the soft earth like stones dropped into porridge. That sounds like good news. But it isn't. Napoleon delayed the battle's start to let the ground dry, and that gave the Prussians, who are marching toward the battlefield right now, the extra hours they needed to arrive in time. Rain that may have saved your life this morning will help destroy your army this afternoon. Recent research has connected this abnormal rainfall to the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the previous April, which disrupted weather patterns across the entire planet. A volcano on the other side of the world contributed to the mud that shaped the outcome of Waterloo. History doesn't do subtlety. By approximately 11:30 in the morning on June 18th, 1815, the rain has stopped. The field stretches before you, about 3 miles wide, 2 low ridges separated by a shallow valley of rye. On the opposite ridge, the Duke of Wellington has positioned roughly 68 to 74,000 troops behind the crest, most of them invisible to you, because he's employing his signature reverse slope defense. You cannot see what you're about to walk into. Wellington himself called his force an infamous army, very weak and ill-equipped, and many of his Dutch-Belgian troops had served under Napoleon only a year earlier, which explains why he deliberately mixed nationalities at corps and divisional level to shore up the weaker contingents. 3 fortified positions anchor his line: the walled chateau of Hougoumont on the right, the farmhouse of La Haie-Sainte in the center, and Papelotte on the far left. Your army fields about 72,000 men with 250 guns, while the Prussians, plus another 48 to 50,000 troops, are somewhere to the east, marching through difficult terrain. Combined, the Allied forces will eventually outnumber you nearly 2 to 1, though you do not know this yet. Napoleon, back at his headquarters, dismissed warnings about the Prussians and called Wellington a bad general, declaring the affair nothing more serious than eating one's breakfast. Whether Napoleon was fully himself that day remains its own debate. His brother Jerome later confirmed that Napoleon was suffering from thrombosed hemorrhoids, and some accounts indicate he received laudanum the night before. Historian Andrew Roberts calls the illness explanation, an apologist device, noting Napoleon was mounted and active by 8 in the morning. All the same, the man directing this battle may have been doing so while unable to sit comfortably on his horse. Something almost cosmically absurd lives in the idea of Europe's fate hinging on the state of one man's backside. For many of his soldiers, that morning's breakfast will be their last. Before we get to the killing, you need to understand what a Napoleonic battle actually felt like, because nothing in modern experience prepares you for it. The French Grand Battery, roughly 80 guns, produces a continuous roar audible for miles, while thousands of muskets firing in volleys layer a crashing undertone on top. Military drummers beat the pas de charge, the rapid rhythm signaling a bayonet attack. And beneath all of it rise the screams of wounded men and dying horses. The most disorienting element by far is the smoke. Our black powder generates dense white clouds that choke visibility to nearly zero within minutes of the first volley. One participant described spending the entire day blinded by smoke, trodden in the mud, and galloped over by every scoundrel who had a horse. And Captain Grono, standing inside an infantry square, wrote that they were nearly suffocated by the smoke and smell of burnt cartridge. You stand shoulder to shoulder in ranks 3 deep, firing at an enemy you cannot see, while cannonballs and musket balls cut through the haze around you. Officers carry swords partly to keep you in line, and running is not an option because the men behind you will not let you leave, and the men in front need you there. French artillery opened fire on Hougoumont around 11:30, and what Napoleon intended as a limited diversion became an all-day bloodbath that eventually consumed about 14,000 French troops. At one point, a lieutenant nicknamed the Smasher hacked through the north gate with an axe, and roughly 30 French soldiers plus 1 drummer boy burst inside before the British slammed the gate shut behind them. Every Frenchman inside was killed, except the drummer boy, who was spared. Wellington later wrote that the success of the entire battle turned on the closing of those gates. And that's when the question of Marshal Grouchy becomes important. He controlled 33,000 men and 96 guns, and Napoleon had sent him to pursue the Prussians after Ligny. As the famous story places Grouchy eating strawberries at a notary's house in Volhain when the guns of Waterloo are heard around 11:30. General Gérard urged him to march toward the sound of battle, and Grouchy refused, citing his written orders to march on Wavre. He would spend the afternoon fighting the Prussian rearguard at Wavre, while the main Prussian army marched away to destroy Napoleon. Modern historians are increasingly sympathetic, pointing out that Grouchy was on the wrong side of the Dyle River without bridges, and probably could not have arrived in time regardless. But Napoleon made him the scapegoat from St. Helena, and that verdict stuck for 2 centuries. None of that matters to you right now, because your nightmare begins around 1:30 in the afternoon. Napoleon assembles approximately 80 guns along the ridge, the famous Grand Battery, and unleashes a bombardment on Wellington's center. But its effectiveness is severely limited, because Wellington's infantry lies behind the reverse slope, and the sodden ground simply swallows the cannonballs. Only Bylandt's Dutch-Belgian brigade, left exposed on the forward slope, takes the full impact. You advance under cover of this bombardment if you are in d'Erlon's First Corps, 17,000 infantry marching uphill through chest-high rye in a formation your commanders have never used before. Massive rectangular blocks, roughly 200 men, widdened 27 ranks deep, present enormous targets to an enemy you cannot see, while the mud pulls off your gaiters and even your shoes. As a 22-year veteran named Captain Duthilt later wrote that the soldiers were already exhausted before they reached the crest. And then the crest explodes around you. British infantry rise from the grass and deliver volleys at 40 to 50 yards. Sir Thomas Picton orders the charge and is immediately shot through the head and killed. Picton had been fighting in a civilian top hat because his uniform was damaged at Quatre Bras 2 days earlier. British heavy cavalry thunder into your disordered ranks next, with the Scots Greys charging through screaming Scotland forever and capturing 2 Imperial Eagle standards. Your entire corps is driven back with roughly 4,000 casualties in about 90 minutes, and if you survive it, you stumble back down the slope, ears ringing, missing your hat and possibly your shoes, was waiting for what comes next. What comes next is worse. And as catastrophic as that sounds, we haven't even reached the most spectacular disaster of the day, and trust me, you want to stay for that. Around 4 in the afternoon, Marshal Ney commits what historians almost unanimously consider one of the worst tactical decisions of the Napoleonic Wars. He mistakes the movement of Allied wounded being evacuated for a retreat, and launches a massive cavalry charge with no infantry support, no artillery support, just cavalry riding straight into infantry squares. The first wave sends roughly 4,800 cuirassiers and guard cavalry up the slope, and when that fails, more cavalry is committed. Eventually, about 9,000 horsemen in 67 squadrons are charging repeatedly on a front only 500 yards wide, with between 7 and 12 separate charges pounding uphill over about 2 hours. Every officer in the French army knows that infantry squares, those dense rectangles of men bristling with bayonets on all sides, are virtually invulnerable to unsupported cavalry. Ney sends the cavalry anyway. Allied gun crews simply sprint into the infantry squares when the cavalry approaches, wait for the horses to thunder past, run back out, and fire into the cavalry's retreating backs. The French riders never even spike the captured guns, which means the same artillery tears into them on every single charge and retreat. Napoleon reportedly called the attack an hour too soon. 47% of the Guard heavy cavalry division went down in those charges, and 5 horses were shot from under Ney during the course of the day, when by the end he was on foot, face blackened by powder, waving a broken sword, screaming at retreating men, "Come and see how a Marshal of France meets his death." France's finest mounted troops were destroyed without breaking a single Allied square, the most magnificent and most pointless cavalry action in the history of modern warfare. Around 6 in the evening, the crisis shifts to Wellington's side. La Haye Sainte farmhouse falls after its German defenders run out of ammunition. Of approximately 360 men who defended it, only 39 survive. Ney places artillery just 275 meters from Wellington's center and begins shredding the Allied line, sending desperately to Napoleon for reinforcements. Napoleon's reply captures the desperation of the moment. Troops? Where does he expect me to find them? Does he expect me to make them? By now, the Prussians have arrived to the east. Marshal Blücher, 72 years old, battered from being crushed under a dead horse 2 days earlier, and reportedly reeking of schnapps and rhubarb liniment, drives his army forward with the declaration that he has given his word to Wellington, and surely they do not want him to break it. Fierce fighting erupts in the village of Plancenoit, directly behind the French right flank, and Napoleon has to throw in battalions of the Young Guard and then the Old Guard just to keep his line of retreat open. The Prussians are grinding into his army like a vice closing. Around 7 in the evening, Napoleon plays his final card, committing 5 battalions of the Middle Guard, roughly 4,000 of France's finest infantry, as the 3rd and 4th Chasseurs à pied, and the 3rd and 4th Grenadiers, men who have marched across Europe and never broken. To boost morale, messengers spread a deliberate lie through the ranks, telling everyone that those approaching troops to the east are Grouchy's reinforcements, not Prussians. The Guard advances uphill with drums beating the pas de charge and cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" If you are in this formation, you are marching into the most famous last stand in European military history, and you are marching into it based on a lie. British guards lying hidden in the tall grass receive Wellington's personal order. "Now, Maitland, now's your time." And they rise to pour devastating volleys into the Guard at near point-blank range. Or Colonel Colborne of the 52nd Light Infantry wheels 1,000 men onto the Guard's exposed flank with enfilade fire, and a Dutch-Belgian division bayonet charges and breaks the last formations. And then comes a cry that has not been heard in 15 years of war. La Garde recule. The Guard is retreating. French morale collapses in minutes. Shouts of trahison, treachery, because the soldiers now realize they were lied to about Grouchy, and sauve qui peut. Every man for himself. Sweep through what remains of the army. Wellington rides onto the crest, waves his hat, and the entire Allied line surges forward. 2 squares of Old Guard grenadiers stand near La Belle Alliance, like rocks in a river, buying time while everything around them dissolves. The rest is rout. Surviving the collapse only earns you a Prussian pursuit through the darkness, with Blücher's cavalry hunting fleeing Frenchmen through the night. The army ceases to exist as an organized force. Over the course of the day and its aftermath, roughly 40,000 French soldiers are killed, wounded, captured, or desert, more than half the army gone in a single day. Wellington, surveying the carnage, told a friend, "It has been a damned nice thing. The nearest run thing you ever saw in your life." He also wrote that nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won. One famous exchange captures the numb exhaustion of the day's final moments. Lord Uxbridge, whose leg was shattered by one of the last cannonballs, announced, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg." And Wellington replied, "By God, sir." "Oh, so you have." Uxbridge's amputated leg was buried at a house in Waterloo village, where it became a tourist attraction. One last quote deserves attention. General Cambronne, commanding the last square of the Old Guard, was allegedly asked to surrender, and the romantic version has him declaring, "The Guard dies, but does not surrender." Cambronne himself denied saying it, and his logic was airtight. He pointed out that he could not have said, "The Guard dies but does not surrender," because he did not die, and he did surrender. Victor Hugo popularized an alternative version claiming Cambronne simply said merde, and Cambronne denied that one too. What the evidence actually shows is that a British colonel named Halkett grabbed Cambronne by his uniform and captured him before any legendary words could have been spoken. A journalist likely invented the whole thing. History is full of great quotes that nobody actually said. Between 17 and 20,000 French soldiers were wounded rather than killed, and each man's fate depended entirely on luck. The French army had Baron Dominique Jean Larrey, quite possibly the most brilliant battlefield surgeon in history, who invented the flying ambulance, a fast horse-drawn carriage that could reach the wounded in as little as 15 minutes. Larrey could amputate a leg in 1 minute and an arm in 17 seconds. No anesthesia existed, so you either got alcohol if supplies held out, or you were simply held down. Amputation mortality dropped from over 90% when surgery was delayed to less than 25% when Larrey performed it quickly. And that speed saved more lives than any other medical innovation on the battlefield. But Larrey could not reach everyone. Allied wounded weren't fully removed for 2 days, and French wounded, belonging to the losing side, lay on the field for 3, 4, even 5 nights. A visitor 4 days after the battle described heaps of wounded men with mangled limbs, unable to move, perishing from untreated wounds and hunger. And while you lay there, the scavengers came, not just for teeth, but for buttons, boots, weapons, anything of value. Later, the bones themselves were harvested. The London Observer reported in 1822 that more than 1 million bushels of human and inhuman bones had been imported from European battlefields into the port of Hull for use as fertilizer. But Belgian records show bone exports jumping from 0 to 350,000 kilograms by 1834, and bone char was used in sugar refining. Archaeologists have found almost no skeletal remains at Waterloo, despite mass graves that should have contained thousands of bodies. The graves were systematically emptied because the dead were worth more as raw material than as memories. Tourism, for its part, started the very next day, with a carriage arriving from Brussels on June 19th to examine the field and guidebooks appearing within weeks. A sergeant major named Edward Cotton survived the battle, settled nearby, and became Waterloo's first professional battlefield guide until his death in 1849. The Lion's Mound, that enormous hill in the photographs, was built between 1823 and 1826 using 300,000 cubic meters of earth scraped from Wellington's actual ridge. The construction destroyed the terrain that won the battle in order to commemorate the battle. Victor Hugo put it simply, the field had been disfigured for the sake of glorifying it. So then, the question we started with, whether you could have survived one battle in Napoleon's army at Waterloo. Mathematically, your overall odds of walking off the field unwounded were roughly 60 to 65%, better than a coin flip. But that number is a lie told by averages, because survival depended almost entirely on which unit you were assigned to and which phase of the battle you were fed into. Serving in d'Erlon's corps during the first infantry assault gave you roughly a 1 in 4 chance of becoming a casualty within 90 minutes. Riding as a cuirassier in Ney's cavalry charges pushed those odds to nearly 1 in 2. Marching with the Imperial Guard in the final advance meant roughly 1 in 3. And if you survived the repulse, you still faced a Prussian pursuit through the night. The wrong regiment at the wrong hour, and your odds collapsed entirely. And even if you survived all of it, the bombardment, the musketry, the cavalry, the rout, the pursuit, you still had to survive the peace. Ney faced a firing squad on December the 7th, 1815, and gave the order to fire himself. Napoleon died on St. Helena 6 years later. The army you served in was dissolved, and the empire you fought for ceased to exist. Somewhere in London, a gentleman sat down to dinner, wearing your dead comrade's teeth, on a plate sweetened with sugar refined through your dead comrade's bones, and never thought about either of them at all. Captain Kincaid of the 95th Rifles observed that after Waterloo, the usual morning question, "Who's been hit?" had changed. It was easier, he noted, to simply ask, "Who's alive?" That is the arithmetic of Waterloo. Not whether you could survive it, but whether surviving it was really the hard part.